The Amazing Digital Circus, a worldwide phenomenon with hundreds of millions of views, the most successful release in indie animation history, and an instant icon in modern-day pop culture. But to me, I found it to be a show with an interesting premise and interesting characters, with lackluster execution in many areas, making it hard for me to be excited for the next installment in this cultural phenomenon. And I'm glad I wasn't, for The Amazing Digital Circus's second episode, Candy Carrier Chaos, is such a massive failure in my eyes that, like Pomni, I had a hard time processing what I was subjected to. I'm going to go over a summary of the events that happened in this episode, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The episode begins with Pomni in a nightmare about her becoming abstracted and being cast into the pit just like Kaufmo was in the last episode. She awakes and finds Ragatha at her door, reassuring her that there is no hard feelings between them after Pomni left Ragatha behind in the previous episode and escorts her to find Kane for their next adventure. Kane explains that their next goal is to find some bandits who stole some maple syrup from the Candy Canyon Kingdom. Zubul is completely uninterested and leaves while the rest of the crew is transported to the kingdom and meets the princess who supplies them with a truck to chase down the bandits with. The cast quickly catches up to the bandits and Jax throws Pomni between the trucks in an attempt to make a bridge, but she loses her grip and ends up on the top of the bandits' truck instead. Kinger tries to help Pomni by throwing an anchor, but overshoots the truck, causing it to fall into a cannon on the other side, pulling the cast truck down with it, and knocking the bandits' truck out of control, causing it to glitch and phase Pomni and one of the bandits through the map before launching into the sky. The bandit that fell to the bottom of the map finds all the assets for the adventure, including himself and every other NPC, and begins to have an existential breakdown before being joined by Pomni and questions her about what is happening. He asks her what he is, and she explains everything, completely shattering his perception of reality. Pomni tries to cheer him up and tells him that if they can get out of wherever they are, he can come back to the circus with her, as she could use a friend. The bandit brightens up and introduces himself as Gummigoo, and Pomni begins to conjure a plan by using the physics of other objects to try to make the copy of the truck glitch again, launching them upwards. Meanwhile, the rest of the cast find themselves at the bottom of the canyon, in a fudge river, as a giant creature made of fudge tries to eat them. Ragatha explains that they aren't candy, stopping the creature as it apologizes and introduces itself as the fudge. The fudge explains that it used to live in the kingdom, but was banished after it started eating the townsfolk. Jack strikes a deal with the fudge that if it helps them out of the canyon, he will help the fudge inside the kingdom again. And right on cue, before they leave, the bandit truck falls into the canyon, allowing the cast to capture them. On the way back to the kingdom with the fudge, Pomni and Gummigoo's truck falls out of the sky, landing on the fudge, killing him, and reuniting everyone again. Gingle asks why there are two trucks, and Kinger discovers that both trucks are filled with syrup, and Gummigoo requests that his bandits take one of the trucks back to his village, so everyone's happy. The cast returns to the kingdom delivering the maple syrup, and right before they leave, Jax is pleasantly surprised that the fudge came back to life, and because he left the gate unlocked, was able to get in and starts terrorizing the kingdom. Once everyone is back in the circus, Kane is surprised that an NPC got through, and immediately vaporizes Gummigoo out of fear of losing track of who is real and an NPC, making Pomni nearly lose her mind. Ragatha tries to cheer her up and invites Pomni to Kaufmo's funeral, which Zubul had been setting up while they were away. Everyone makes a speech honoring Kaufmo's memory, and the episode ends with Pomni re-entering her nightmare, but this time, when she falls into the pit, everyone besides Jax grabs her hand to save her. The Amazing Digital Circus is very much a character-focused show, relying on interactions as opposed to a strong narrative or fleshed-out lore to uncover, so one could argue that the most important thing for the Digital Circus to get right is the characters, and this episode does that very well. For 3 of them. Just like the last episode, Pomni is always the most interesting character in every scene she's in, with the only difference being that instead of panicking, she has fallen into a more depressed state, mourning that this is her new existence, and trying her best not to interact with it. This sounds like this may make her a boring character to watch, and she probably would be if she wasn't being tortured throughout the entire episode, bringing out some absolutely hilarious reactions. This alone would sell me on how well she is utilized in this episode, but she is given a sort of mini arc as she befriends Gummigoo and tries to cheer him up, which is exactly the kind of arc she needed as she is snapped out of her depressed state, so she can help someone who is in a similar situation as her, developing her surprisingly mature and gentle demeanor when it comes to helping others, and forcing her to engage with the world she's in, as she needs to lead by example, for Gummigoo's sake, showcasing her motivation and problem-solving abilities. As for Gummigoo himself, I don't really care about him, as he is obviously a support who exists only to develop Pomni, and he doesn't really have that interesting of a personality. His standout moment in the episode is the existential crisis he goes through when he discovers he's an NPC, which, while I think was a great portrayal of realizing and coping with your reality being shattered, it doesn't hit as hard as it should have, as just one episode prior we already witnessed the entire coping with existential dread plot hook with Pomni. So although the circumstances are different, there is nothing Gummigoo is going through that we haven't already seen just an episode prior, making the entire segment feel stale and overplayed within 2 episodes of the show. In fact, I would say that almost every character's gimmick in this show already feels played out, with the exception of Pomni and, surprisingly, Jax. Jax is still the Jax we saw in episode 1, but it feels like his cruelty has been dialed to 11. I love how heavily they are leaning towards Jax being a complete jerk, as it is rare for most animated series to write a character who is borderline abusive but still equally charming, creating a conflict for the viewer on whether they should like Jax as a character or not, just like how a manipulative abuser often charms their victims into liking them despite the victim knowing how awful they really are. And based on one of Gooseworks' tweets after the pilot aired, this may have been planned since the character's inception, which is a brilliantly twisted way of making the audience engage and feel more invested in the development of the character, be it for better or worse. However, every single problem I had with Jax in the pilot is still going strong in this episode, as he overshadows every single character so severely that everyone he interacts with becomes an accessory to him, where he is always in control, making his relationships with everyone in the digital circus feel one-sided and predictable. Back in my pilot review, I emphasized this point by pointing out how Zubal's character is at the mercy of Jax throughout the entire episode and never feels like she's her own character because of it, and that vicious relationship is repeated in this episode with Gangle, as Gangle doesn't do anything noteworthy throughout this episode that didn't revolve around Jax. And just like Jax, every problem I had with Gangle also is repeated in this episode, as her main gimmick of having dual personalities is barely shown at all, as just like in the first episode, her mask is broken near the start of the episode. I really like Gangle conceptually, but the very concept of this character 2 episodes in still hasn't been shown at all, and while I do think she is great comedic relief when she's sad, there are so many possibilities that can be done with an aggressively happy character that, based on how extreme her sad state is, would probably be borderline psychotically happy, which I desperately want to see. And just like Gangle, Kinger fails to live up to his potential, as not only does he not do anything throughout the entire episode, but he also isn't even close to as funny as he was in the pilot. There's always the possibility that Kinger will become more than just a comedic relief character, but the pilot established him to be one, so it is reasonable to expect that he would continue to have some standout comedic moments, but there are none to be found. He does have some in-character goofy moments, but if you removed him from the episode, nothing of value would be lost, similar to Zubal, who, just like in the last episode, was completely absent. I understand that it's in character for her not to want to engage in these adventures, but for her to do nothing 2 episodes in a row is bad screen time balancing. If we even had some little comedic moments like while the main cast is going through chaos, the show would just cut away to her doing something mundane or engaging in a hobby of hers, so we can at least passively get to know her better. But as is, having Zubal be completely absent 2 episodes in a row was a terrible decision, and it wouldn't have been difficult to shove in some Deus Ex Machina or MacGuffin to force her to participate, just like how Gummigoo forced Pomni to take action and do something in this episode. Just have Jax take one of her arms and run through the portal, forcing her to chase him. Seriously, it's not that hard. As for Ragatha, I like her just as much as I did in the pilot personality-wise, but she also falls into the same issue Gangle and Kinger have, where she doesn't do anything. The most notable thing about Ragatha in this episode is her interaction with Pomni at the beginning of the episode, where she tells Pomni not to worry about leaving her behind, which is a bizarre decision to make with her character. In the pilot episode, there is a scene where you can visibly see that Ragatha is uncomfortable or hurt that Pomni left her behind. I never did and still don't understand the meaning of this scene, but it was put there for a reason and set up what I could only assume to be a character dynamic that would revolve around Pomni trying to make amends with Ragatha for what she did. But that moment is completely retconned when Ragatha directly addresses Pomni leaving her and brushes it off as not a big deal, despite it obviously affecting Ragatha in some way in the first episode. This retcon isn't that big a deal, as Ragatha and Pomni's interactions are some of the best in the episode, just like they were in the pilot, but I hate when characters' actions that negatively affect another character don't have any long-term consequences, making Pomni deserting Ragatha feel completely inconsequential. But like I said, even without this dynamic, Ragatha and Pomni are such a great duo. And I might be saying that just because they are my favorite characters, but I should address how one-sided their relationship is. We are only in the second episode of the show, so of course there is plenty of time for these two to develop their friendship, but at the moment Ragatha's entire existence revolves around trying to cheer Pomni up, and Pomni will just not budge. It's slightly concerning that we are 2 episodes in and Ragatha has yet to do anything besides get angry at Jax and dote over Pomni. Again, there is plenty of time for her to develop, but we need to see some more from Ragatha sooner as opposed to later. Lastly, there's Cain and the Fudge. I want to compare and contrast these two as they are both reflections of Digital Circus improving and stagnating on how it handles its characters since the pilot. Cain felt overbearing in the pilot and works a lot better as a come-and-go supporting cast member to set up the events of each episode, and that's exactly how this episode utilizes him. Digital Circus changing how they utilized Cain felt like a genuine step forward for how the show respects both its screen time and one of its characters. But then on the complete other end of the spectrum is the Fudge, who is just a reskin of the Gloink Queen, who doesn't do anything except disrupt the pacing of the episode and occupy the cast with something menial, so they have something to do even if it doesn't have any payoff whatsoever. I feel like many fans were critical enough of the Gloink Queen and the B-plot of the pilot for it to be obvious to not repeat making the same mistakes the pilot did in this regard, and this episode didn't learn from those critiques to an almost eyebrow-raising degree. Pomni gets separated from the group, the rest of the cast encounter a monster of middling intelligence who offers nothing to the narrative or the episode itself. Any threat or problem the monster poses is stopped by something falling on top of it, with no effort required from the cast, and that's it. The Fudge is such a bafflingly poor use of screen time, is so similar to the Gloink Queen, and feels so out of place in this episode that a part of me is conspiratorial about the success of the pilot influencing the development of this episode to be artificially stretched out to a runtime that won't disappoint the masses, or to be as similar to the pilot as possible, out of fear that changing the formula that got the pilot 300 million views will fail to yield the same results. Either way, the Fudge is a terrible addition to this episode that only detracted from its overall quality. So, in a character-driven show, how well were the characters used? Not great, but Pomni, Jax, and Cain are the reason I'm not saying the characterization of the cast is bad. Pomni is as great as she was in the pilot and is evolving as a character, Jax is not pulling any of his punches on who he is, and Cain is utilized much better in this episode than the previous. But everyone else ranges from dull to bad, with Gummigoo being a pretty bland character with a plot hook that feels repetitive. Kinger is a direct downgrade that didn't even need to be in this episode. Every problem I had with Gangle continues to hold the character back, and Zooble is such an inconsequential character that she might as well not exist. Beyond the characters, this episode isn't narrative heavy, which I never expected this show to be, but the actual events that happen within this episode leave a lot to be desired, and that's mostly because of the pacing. Once the cast is actually sent out to look for Gummigoo and his bandits, they almost immediately find them with no build-up, which gave me total whiplash, as by the time the action began, I was still trying to get invested into the journey and the world. In all fairness, jumping straight into the action does get the viewer invested in the episode, but if this is going to be a character-driven show, I couldn't think of a better moment to develop the relationship between the cast members than having them all being packed into a truck driving to a destination. Just 2 minutes of seeing the cast bicker or talk or anything where they just engage with one another would have probably been the best moment in this episode, because the best moments in Digital Circus are the character interactions. But instead, they immediately catch up to the bandits despite the bandits having a considerable head start, and the truck versus truck battle ensues, which was the best segment of the entire episode, as we get some great character interactions between Jax, Gangle, and Pomni, but Kinger and Ragatha didn't do anything whatsoever. Still, what we did get of Jax tormenting his teammates was entertaining, and the action is just tense enough to engage the viewer. But once the battle is over and we hit the 9-minute mark, the pacing of this episode falls off a cliff, with Gummigoo and Pomni's A-plot and the rest of the cast's B-plot with the fudge. Everything that happens in the A-plot feels like it's happening in slow motion, as most of the scenes drag on way too long, and there are next to no standout moments during Pomni and Gummigoo's sequence to look forward to, making rewatching these scenes a drag that feels like it's deliberately wasting my time. But the worst part about the A-plot with Gummigoo and Pomni is that it doesn't only feel like it's a waste of time, but also that it's just boring. I can appreciate that a large chunk of the episode tried to tell an emotional and mature plot point so that Pomni can grow as a character, but it leads to no proper payoff as Gummigoo dies anyway, leaving her efforts in everything that happened in the A-plot that took up such a significant portion of this episode in vain. And what should have resulted in a major breaking point for her character after Gummigoo was killed, she shrugs off right afterward like nothing happened when she goes to Kaufmo's funeral and suddenly is cheered up and is shown that she is beginning to trust the rest of the cast, which makes no sense as just like in the first episode, she barely even interacted with the cast. Instead of introducing an entirely new character so that Pomni can learn to trust the others, shouldn't she actually engage with the supporting cast directly to learn more about them and begin to trust them naturally? One would think so, as I think if even a kindergartner wrote this episode, they would understand that for a character to build a relationship with other characters, they have to engage and interact with them. But instead, she is entirely separated from the cast for most of the episode, and you expect me to believe that she is beginning to trust them due to her experience with Gummigoo, even though she hasn't had a single meaningful interaction with any of the cast besides Ragatha, who she repeatedly keeps pushing away despite her saying to Gummigoo that she could use a friend, which Ragatha has been trying so hard to be, only to be given the cold shoulder from Pomni, and now at the end of the episode, Pomni just suddenly trusts Ragatha even though she has been treating her like a total nuisance? As for the others, I rewatched the pilot, and between that episode and this one, she has had a total of one brief one-sided interaction with Zubul, a single interaction with Kinger, and has not once interacted with Gangle. Pomni's destination of trusting the rest of the cast has already been reached before even starting the journey, within 2 episodes of the show. As for the B-plot, I already went over this when I talked about the fudge. It sucks. It doesn't benefit the episode in any way, feels like it was reused from the pilot, and only made the pacing of this episode worse than it already is. This B-plot could have been good, and I'm not even going to explain how, as it is acknowledged in the episode itself.
Gotta say, this is a lot more anticlimactic than I was hoping it'd be.
What were you hoping for?
You know, like one big final battle, bloodshed, death, chaos, whatever.
Lastly, there's the comedy, which also fails as the timing, delivery, and punchlines all fall flat, and the lol so random moments that this series' humor relies on are not sticking the landing. I will give this episode credit though, as even though Gummigoo's death was a horrible decision that trivialized the A-plot, I swear I was probably laughing for a straight minute when he died. In fact, I found Gummigoo's death so hilariously twisted that I would slot it as the best moment in the amazing digital circus thus far, and was the only seriously enjoyable part of this episode. And funny enough, I think Gummigoo's death might be a great analogy for the biggest issue this series has in a sort of meta way. Nothing that happens in the amazing digital circus matters. None of the characters have shown any signs of development in themselves or with their relationships with one another, unless they are forced to like Pomni was. All the adventures they go on don't change anything and as a result have no stakes. And just like Pomni and the rest of everyone in this show, the viewer is trapped in the stagnant purgatory that is this show, as nothing matters or has any long-lasting and meaningful outcome. Of course, this is the only second episode, but as it stands with everything that has been presented by the show so far, I have been given no justifiable reason to look forward or be invested in the next installment of this series. Candy Carrier Chaos feels almost like a reimagining of the pilot episode, not only repeating the same mistakes the pilot made, but also following the same narrative beats for the A and B plot, but with worse pacing, comedy, and utilization of the cast. The only things this episode did better than the pilot were its utilization of Kane and its fleshing out of who Jax is personality-wise, but other than that, the content that fills this episode's bloated runtime has no consequences, feels unengaging, and is the worst thing a form of entertainment can be: boring. It doesn't matter to me how many views this episode may get within a day, week, or month of its release, as the Amazing Digital Circus is so popular that Glitch could release an episode of this show that fails to be entertaining, is stretched out so long that it feels like it wastes the viewer's time, and is one of the most wearisome, uninspiring, and insulting excuses of amusement in the indie animation sphere, and it would still get tens of millions of views that nobody would want to point out as being a disappointment out of fear of being attacked by this show's massive fan base. And you know how I know that as a fact? It's because that is what Candy Carrier Chaos is. Out of all the episodes of shows I have reviewed since I started this channel, the Amazing Digital Circus astonished me by releasing a contender for the worst piece of indie animation I have had the misfortune of reviewing, and above all, is not worth your time.
I could use a friend.
Hey, Pomni. How'd you sleep?
Sounds fun.
What do you think, Pomni?
We're already friends with the princess.
Oh, Pomni. I'm sure there's some way you could help out here.
Poor Pomni.
I'm more worried she's having another horrible experience.
Are you okay?
Hey, that's good of you
Sorry
about that, Pomni. I don't think she really likes me that much.